Picture this. It's 1916 in a small Ukrainian town called Biela Tserkva, just south of Kiev. A baby girl is born who will grow up to become one of the most feared soldiers in human history. Her name is Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and before her 26th birthday, she will have looked through a rifle scope and taken the lives of 309 enemy soldiers with deadly precision. But here's what makes her story truly remarkable. This wasn't just another wartime sniper tale. This is the story of a young history student who became known as Lady Death, then traded her rifle for a microphone to stand before the President of the United States and change the course of the Second World War. And along the way, she formed one of the most unlikely friendships in wartime history with America's First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Let me take you back to where it all began. Young Lyudmila was what folks back then called a tomboy. She refused to let the neighborhood boy beat her at anything. Not at running, not at climbing trees, and certainly not at shooting. When she was just 14 years old, her family moved to Kiev, and that's when something inside her sparked to life. She enrolled in a sharpshooter class, and let me tell you, she wasn't just good, she was exceptional. She earned her Voroshilov sharpshooter badge, which was quite the accomplishment for anyone, let alone a teenage girl in the 1930s Soviet Union. But Lyudmila had bigger dreams than just being a good shot. She wanted to be a teacher, a historian. In 1937, she enrolled at Kiev University to study history. She was smart, ambitious, and determined. During the day, she worked at a local arms factory. At night, she studied. On weekends, she competed on the university track team as a sprinter and pole vaulter. And in whatever spare time she had left, she kept up with her marksmanship, taking courses at a military sniper school. She was preparing herself for something, though she didn't quite know what yet. By the spring of 1941, Lyudmila was in her fourth year of university, just 24 years old, already a divorced mother with a young son named Rostislav. She was on track to graduate, become a history teacher, and live a quiet life of scholarship. That's what she wanted. That's what she'd worked for. But then on June 22, 1941, everything changed. Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, and the German Wehrmacht came crashing across the Soviet border like a tidal wave of steel and fire. When news of the invasion reached Kiev, Lyudmila didn't hesitate. She went straight to the recruiting office in Odessa, one of the very first volunteers. Now you have to understand something about those times. The military didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat for women who wanted to fight. When Lyudmila walked into that recruiting office and said she wanted to join the infantry, the registrar looked at her like she'd grown a second head. He suggested she'd be better suited as a nurse. Maybe work in an office, pushing papers, anything but combat. But Lyudmila wasn't having any of it. She'd completed her shooting certificates, her training courses. She knew what she could do. So the army decided to test her. They took her to the front lines, handed her a Mosin Nagant Model 1891 bolt-action rifle, and pointed to two Romanian soldiers who were collaborating with the Germans. They were about 400 meters away, roughly 4 football fields. They told her to shoot them. 2 shots later, 2 men were dead. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was officially a Red Army sniper, assigned to the 25th Rifle Division. Here's something that shows you the kind of person she was. She never counted those first 2 kills in her official tally. To her, those were just test shots, not real combat. Her real war, began on August 8, 1941, in a place called Bielyaivka. Those early days of the war were absolute chaos. The Germans were advancing fast, and the Soviets were fighting desperately to slow them down. Lyudmila found herself in the siege of Odessa, defending the city along with thousands of other Soviet soldiers. Now, I need you to understand what being a sniper actually meant. This wasn't like in the movies. A sniper in World War II would lie completely still, in the same position for 15, sometimes 20 hours at a stretch, often 600 to 1,000 feet ahead of their own lines, right in no man's land. In summer, you'd bake under the sun. In winter, you'd freeze. You couldn't move, couldn't sneeze, couldn't even swat away a fly buzzing around your face. One wrong move, one moment of carelessness, and you'd be dead. And Lyudmila was good at it, really good. In her first 75 days of combat during the siege of Odessa, she recorded 187 confirmed kills. That's more than 2 enemy soldiers every single day. Among those were officers, the men leading troops into battle, the ones making decisions. Taking them out wasn't just about numbers. It was about disrupting the enemy's command structure, sowing confusion in their ranks. By October 1941, Odessa was falling. The Romanian army was closing in, and the Soviets had to evacuate. Lyudmila and her unit were pulled out by ship and sent to the Crimean Peninsula, to a city called Sevastopol. That's where her legend would really be born. Sevastopol was hell on earth. The Germans had the city surrounded, and they were determined to take it. The fighting was brutal, constant, and unforgiving. Soviet casualties were staggering. But for a sniper like Lyudmila, it also meant targets. Lots of targets. The higher her kill count climbed, the more dangerous her assignments became. Her commanders started giving her what they called counter-sniper missions. That's sniper versus sniper. Deadly duels where both shooters were experts, both knew all the tricks, and only one would walk away. Lyudmila fought 36 of these duels, and she won every single one. One of those duels lasted 3 entire days. For 72 hours, she and a German sniper stalked each other, neither willing to give up, neither making a mistake. Finally, as she would later describe it, he made one move too many. She squeezed the trigger, and he was gone. The Germans knew about her. Oh, they knew. They started calling her things I can't repeat on this channel, but one nickname stuck. Lady Death, and they didn't just talk about her among themselves. They actually tried to communicate with her directly over radio loudspeakers at the front lines. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the messages would blare in Russian, come over to us. We will give you plenty of chocolate and make you a German officer. When the bribes didn't work, the threats started. If we catch you, we will tear you into 309 pieces and scatter them to the winds. Now, most people would find that terrifying, but Lyudmila, she later said she was delighted. She was happy that the enemy had counted her kills correctly. That was the kind of woman she was. By May 1942, her confirmed kill count stood at 257. She was promoted to lieutenant, but the fighting was taking its toll. She'd been wounded 3 times already. Shell shock was setting in, and then, in June 1942, during one of the massive German bombardments of Sevastopol, a mortar shell exploded near her position. Shrapnel tore through her face and body. This was her 4th and final combat wound. The Soviet High Command made a decision. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had become too valuable to risk losing. She'd become a symbol, a hero, proof that Soviet forces could stand against the Nazi war machine. They evacuated her by submarine from the besieged city, got her to a hospital, and when she recovered, they didn't send her back to the front. They gave her a new mission, a diplomatic one. Most of her unit, including many of her closest comrades, would die at Sevastopol within a month. The 25th Rifle Division would be officially disbanded in July 1942. But Lyudmila would survive to tell their story. September 27, 1942. Washington, D.C., a young Soviet woman steps off a plane onto American soil, flanked by 2 other Soviet delegates and a translator. She's wearing her olive green Soviet Army uniform with her medals pinned to her chest. She speaks no English. She's 25 years old, has been wounded 4 times in combat, and just months earlier was lying in a sniper's position, trading bullets with the best marksman the German army could throw at her. Her name is Junior Lieutenant Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and she has 309 confirmed kills. She's been sent on a mission just as important as any she faced on the battlefield. Joseph Stalin desperately needed the Western Allies to open a second front in Europe, to force Hitler to split his forces and relieve the pressure on Soviet troops who were being ground to dust on the Eastern Front. And the Soviets had decided that Lyudmila was the perfect person to make that case to the American people. She became the first Soviet citizen ever to be received at the White House. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt welcomed her personally. But it was Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, who would change Lyudmila's life. The First Lady saw something in this young warrior that others missed. She saw not just a killer, but a young woman who had sacrificed everything for her country. Eleanor invited Lyudmila to join her on a tour across America to share her story with the American people. The press didn't know what to make of her. The New York Times called her the girl sniper and commented that she wore no makeup and that there wasn't much style to her uniform. At press conferences, reporters asked her if she curled her hair, if she polished her nails, if she was allowed to wear makeup at the front. One reporter even criticized the length of her skirt, saying it made her look fat. At first, Lyudmila was dumbfounded. She'd just survived one of the bloodiest sieges in human history. She'd watched friends die in her arms. She'd stared death in the face every single day for a year. And these American journalists wanted to know about her makeup? She answered politely at first, but you could tell she was stunned. "Who has time to think of her shiny nose when a battle is going on?" she asked. But Eleanor Roosevelt saw what was happening, and she took Lyudmila under her wing. The two women from completely different worlds formed an incredible bond. One was the aristocratic wife of the American president. The other was a working-class Ukrainian who'd killed more enemy soldiers than most entire platoons. But they found common ground in their views on women's rights, on what women were capable of, on the fight against fascism. As Lyudmila toured America with Eleanor at her side, something began to change. She started finding her voice. She began to speak not just as a soldier, but as a witness to what was happening in Europe, as someone who'd seen firsthand what the Nazi war machine was doing to her homeland. She spoke in New York, where Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia gave her a full-length raccoon fur coat. She spoke at factories, at rallies, at union halls, and everywhere she went, she told them the truth. "Every German who remains alive will kill women, children, and old folks," she said. "Dead Germans are harmless. Therefore, if I kill a German, I am saving lives." But the moment that really mattered, the moment that changed everything, came in Chicago. Lyudmila stood before a massive crowd, mostly men, and she'd had enough of being treated like a curiosity, like some exotic creature from a faraway land. She looked out at that sea of faces and said something that cut right to the bone. "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The crowd went silent. For a moment, you could have heard a pin drop, and then the hall erupted. Men who'd been sitting on the fence about American involvement in Europe suddenly understood. If this young woman could fight and sacrifice like this, what excuse did they have? The speech was covered by newspapers across the country. It became one of the most powerful moments of the entire diplomatic tour. The United States government presented her with a Colt semi-automatic pistol. In Toronto, Canada, she was greeted by thousands at Union Station, and they presented her with a Winchester Model 70 rifle with a telescopic sight. In England, she visited Coventry and accepted donations of over £4,000 to buy X-ray units for the Red Army. Everywhere she went, she pressed for a second front. During this tour, something beautiful happened at Hyde Park, the Roosevelt family estate in New York. Eleanor invited Lyudmila to stay there, and one evening, Eleanor even altered a set of her own pajamas so they'd fit her Soviet guest. As Lyudmila changed, Eleanor caught sight of a long, reddish, forked scar running from her shoulder down her spine. It was shrapnel from Sevastopol, one of 4 combat wounds Lyudmila had suffered. Eleanor was so moved that she impulsively hugged the young woman and kissed her forehead, saying, "What dreadful ordeals you have had to endure." Even the folk singer Woody Guthrie was inspired by Lyudmila. He wrote a song about her called Miss Pavlichenko that included the lyrics. Miss Pavlichenko's well known to fame, "Russia's your country, fighting's your game. The whole world will always love you for all time to come. 300 Nazis fell by your gun." Eventually, Lyudmila returned to the Soviet Union. The diplomatic tour was over, and while she'd helped build support for Allied intervention, Stalin and the Soviets would have to wait until June 1944 for D-Day and the opening of that second front in Normandy. By then, the tide had already turned on the Eastern Front, but those extra 2 years had cost millions of Soviet lives. Back home, Lyudmila was promoted to major. She was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, her country's highest honor. A Soviet postage stamp was issued with her image in 1943, but she never returned to combat. Instead, she became an instructor, training other snipers until the war's end. She taught them everything she'd learned in those brutal months at Odessa and Sevastopol. When the war finally ended in 1945, Lyudmila went back to school. She finished her history degree at Kiev University and eventually earned her master's degree. She became exactly what she'd always wanted to be, a historian and researcher. She took a job as a senior researcher for the Soviet Navy, diving into archives and documents far away from the blood and horror of the battlefield. But the war had left its mark. Like so many veterans, Lyudmila suffered from what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD and depression. The things she'd seen, the things she'd done, the friends she'd loved, they haunted her. Her second husband, Leonid Kitsenko, who'd also been a sniper and who she'd met at Sevastopol, had been killed in action shortly after they'd decided to marry. That loss, combined with everything else, weighed heavily on her for the rest of her life. But through all of it, she and Eleanor Roosevelt stayed in touch. They wrote letters to each other about family news, about books they were reading, about peace conferences they attended. Despite living on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain, despite the Cold War that had frozen relations between their countries, these two women maintained their friendship. And then, in 1957, 15 years after they'd first met, something remarkable happened. Eleanor Roosevelt was visiting Moscow on a goodwill tour. The Cold War was at its height. Soviet government handlers kept a tight leash on Eleanor's schedule, watching her every move. But the former First Lady insisted she would not leave Moscow without seeing her old friend. Eventually, after much persistence, Eleanor's request was granted. She was brought to a small two-room apartment where Lyudmila was living. A Soviet handler sat nearby, making sure the conversation stayed appropriate. The two women spoke with cool formality at first, very proper, very careful. But then Lyudmila invented an excuse and pulled Eleanor into the bedroom, away from prying eyes. The moment that door closed, all pretense fell away. Lyudmila threw her arms around Eleanor, half laughing, half crying, telling her how happy she was to see her. And the two old friends, speaking in whispers so the handler wouldn't hear, reminisced about that summer, 15 years earlier, when they'd traveled across America together, about all the people they'd met, about everything they'd shared. On October 10, 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko suffered a stroke. She was 58 years old. She's buried in Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, one of the most prestigious burial grounds in Russia, where many heroes of the Soviet Union rest. Her son, Rostislav, who died in 2007, is buried right beside her. In 1976, 2 years after her death, the Soviet Union issued a second commemorative postage stamp in her honor. But her legacy goes far beyond stamps and medals and official recognition. You see, what Lyudmila Pavlichenko proved was something the world desperately needed to see in 1942, and frankly, still needs to remember today. She proved that courage isn't about how big you are or how loud you can yell. She proved that women are just as capable as men when it comes to defending what they believe in, to standing up to evil, to making hard choices in impossible situations. Think about it. Here was a young woman who just wanted to be a history teacher. She wanted to study the past, to understand how we got to where we are. But when her country was invaded, when her people were threatened, she didn't wait for someone else to do something. She picked up a rifle and went to the front lines. And once she was there, she didn't just survive, she excelled. She became one of the most effective combat soldiers in the entire war. And then, when her fighting days were over, she did something equally important. She used her voice. She traveled to a foreign country where she didn't speak the language, where the press treated her like a curiosity, and she stood before crowds of thousands and challenged them to do better, to do more, to stand up against fascism. That took a different kind of courage than facing down a German sniper, but it was courage nonetheless. There's been a resurgence of interest in Lyudmila's story in recent years. In 2015, a joint Russian-Ukrainian film called Battle for Sevastopol told her story. The first English translation of her memoirs, titled Lady Death, was published in 2018, and more people are discovering this incredible woman who changed history. Her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt reminds us that even in the darkest times, even when nations are at war, even when ideology divides us, human connection can bridge those gaps. Two women from completely different worlds found common ground in their shared belief in human dignity, in women's rights, in the fight against tyranny. And that friendship endured across 15 years and an Iron Curtain because it was real, it was genuine, it was based on mutual respect. So the next time someone tells you that women don't belong in combat, or that they're not tough enough, or that they can't handle the pressure, remember Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Remember the young Ukrainian history student who became Lady Death. Remember the sniper who stared down 309 enemy soldiers and never blinked. Remember the diplomat who challenged America to join the fight against fascism. Remember the friend who maintained a bond across the Iron Curtain. And remember that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a rifle. It's the courage to stand up and use your voice, even when the whole world seems determined to silence you. That's the real legacy of Lady Death.